everyone. I know it's 1 a.m. here in Manila, and it is always a joy and privilege to be of service to our leaders in Southern Africa. We love to fellowship. We love to spend time with our South African brothers and sisters. It's good to see many familiar faces here in the Zoom. I just wish I get a chance to interact with all of you. Maybe again, Lord willing, we get to see each other again one of these days. Thanks to my good friend, of course, Pastor Philip, of course, the regional leadership team for this invitation. I'm really, truly honored. Just wanted to take this moment again to honor all of you pastors and leaders in the Zoom. Again, just for your love for Jesus. Pastor Rogers said what we do because of our love for Jesus. And of course, for sharing the weight and the passion, whether that is your local church, campus ministry, church planting, world missions, but really to see God's kingdom advance in Southern Africa, the African continent, and the world. Today or this evening, I am very honored to speak to you on this leadership subject called the multiplication factor. I think this is such an important subject for us, especially as church leaders. Our internal document that describes who we are as every nation, it says that we are a global movement dedicated to establishing church planting churches. So we're not just planting a church, we are a church planting churches. I hope that every church you plant, or at least your current church, you see your church as one that will be planting other churches and not just be a consumer of aid and help all the time, but really to turn our churches to become church planting churches, reaching the next generation on the campus and preaching the gospel to every nation. I think it is no accident that our ministry is called Every Nation, because that speaks of our passion, the seriousness of our intent to advance God's work in every nation. Now, I don't know about you, but nothing can be more exciting than to be a part of a movement whose passion and desire is to see God known and glorified in the nation. That goes way beyond just our current locations, but crucial to the fulfillment of our mission for the work to expand, whether in our cities, the campuses, our nation, and the nations of the world. It is crucial that we become intentional and effective in raising and multiplying leaders. This is where churches can make or break, really. So just like you, we too share the dream that one day we will be in every major city. And as in our case, that is making disciples, training leaders, planting churches in the Philippines, in Asia, and the rest of the world. And one major key why we have massively expanded and grown in both campus ministry and church planting, I believe, is our deliberate, intentional, and successful leadership development in Manila. And this explains why, despite the impact of the global pandemic, and added to that, the workers reduction program, I don't know if you've heard about this, where we have to let go of some of our staff because we are really top heavy in the midst of just pre-pandemic, the explosive growth, churches just hiring a lot of workers. We have to get lean back again to volunteering and all of that. That despite all of that, Victory Metro Manila still has 142 pastors serving in 28 congregations. And we have 189 full-time campus missionaries. That's not for the Philippines, that's just Metro Manila. So that is what is helping us, because every one of these campus missionaries keep engaging students during the time of lockdowns and strict mobility. And we also are about to graduate 35 more of them in the School of Campus Ministry next month. By the way, our schools never stop. We keep graduating an average of 75 a year, at least. Because of the strict pandemic, we went to a strict lockdown. We went to online schools, but still managed to raise a lot of leaders. And despite the challenge of mobility, Just for Metro Manila, by the grace of God, we have baptized 873 last year. So that is something to praise God for. This would not have happened if we don't have that many leaders that just never get tired in discipling people. As for VPC, as we see in the next slide, which stands for Victory Philippine Churches. These are victory churches outside Metro Manila. We now have 219 pastors serving in 117 churches. In fact, our 117th church outside Manila was launched last Sunday. So this is not including Manila. This is just outside. So in the middle of the pandemic last year, we planted 14 brand new churches. And each one of these churches, before they launch only when they're about 150 in average attendance. That means a lot of pre-work or pre-launch is being done. So these are very healthy churches. And 13 more churches are lined up this 2022. On top of that, we have 225 full-time campus missionaries serving outside Metro Manila. Metro Manila is 189, but outside is another 225. And for cross-cultural missionaries, we have 187 long-term missionaries serving in 14 nations. In fact, we sent out teams to 7 more nations in the midst of the travel restrictions. It did have an impact on our 10 days, which we usually average, close to 100 teams a year, but we were creative enough to pull in close to 30 10 days online. So still, our creative teams just make ways how to continually engage the world with the gospel. We would nowhere near achieve these levels of fruitfulness if not for the multiplied number of leaders all across the Philippines. In fact, on a lighter note, this coming May 2022, we will be having our national elections, but just in Metro Manila alone, not even counting churches in the Philippines, 4 winnable mayors are actually members and discipled in the church. 2 of them even grew up from our kids' church. And you know what that will do? That will open greater doors for the gospel. When you have mayor, and these are mayors of cities of more than multi-million numbers of population. So that will open campuses, just the favor of the Lord. It really doesn't take a lot of discernment to realize that much of our expansion and ministry advance is due mainly to the quality and number of leaders raised. I remember what Pastor Steve said before: don't focus on numbers, focus on leaders. If we focus on developing and multiplying leaders, the numbers follow. The numbers take care of itself. For many years, we've focused on making a lot of disciples, but have not really paid much attention to the widening gap of leader to member ratio. From an outside eyes, they would look at our church and say, wow, explosive growth. And you must have heard Pastor Steve said this, we're not really concerned so much about growth. We are paying attention to, are we coping discipleship? Do we have enough, at least 1 to 10 ratio, where for every 10 members, we have 1 small group leader? Because if we take care of leaders, the number simply take care of itself. So what has happened was, it didn't take long. Our growth outpaced our ability to raise leaders. We have to make immediate intervention if we wanted to maintain the balance between just numbers of people attending the church, which for most people, that would be their gauge for a successful ministry, which to us, it's not. So the balance between numbers and the spiritual maturity and fruitfulness of the people is such a big deal to us. As Pastor Steve would always say, don't be flattered or fooled by good growth numbers. Much of our church health indicator is not measured in attendance, but how many disciples and leaders we raise. And it is so easy to let go of that today because we are so massive. The growth is just tremendous, and just focus and just enjoy the momentum. But no, we have to continually look at our ability to continually raise leaders that will take care also of the rest of the members. Pastor Steve also posed in his book, Multiplication Challenge, 2 problems if we don't multiply leaders. One is a present problem and another in the future. He said, if we don't intentionally multiply leaders in the present, we will either plateau or we will crush our current leadership team. And as for the future, if we don't multiply leaders, it will create generational leadership gaps, meaning that the leadership keeps aging, but not enough younger leaders to raise up. So because we failed to pass it to the next generation. So the worst solution would be to simply hire pastors or staff who may pose serious values alignment issues in the future and can create problems for our church. I've seen too many of these happening. Pastors are desperate. A great guy come along. They really have great heart. They serve, but they have a totally different value because their upbringing is not even, the DNA is quite different, and it could cause problems down the road. So the question is, do our current structures have the capacity to allow raising, empowering, and multiplication of leaders? I don't know if you still recall, I shared some years back the ideal setup for multiplying leaders, which I'm going to share in a moment. This principle came out of a conversation between Moses and Jethro in Exodus chapter 18. I love this because it encompasses all levels of leadership. When you talk about small groups, you're sometimes just referring to small group leaders. But I love this conversation because it covers all spectrum of leadership. Jethro noticed that Moses was doing all the work, serving and leading the people. So here's Jethro's comment in verse 14. When Moses' father-in-law saw that that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" I love the way contemporary English version renders it. Jethro saw how much Moses had to do for the people, and he asked, "Why are you the only judge?" The Living Bible says, "Why are you trying to do all this alone, with people standing here all day long to get your help?" It seems like a relevant question to leaders today. Why are you doing things all by yourself? Then Jethro added in verse 17, Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good." Contemporary English version says, "This isn't the best way to do it." And the Message Bible says, "This is no way to go about it." So in verse 18, it says, "You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." I think the Message Bible captures it in our modern translation. "You'll burn out and the people right along with you. This is way too much for you. You can't do this alone." When you're burning out, ministry is not fun anymore. It's stressful. But when you have leaders carrying the weight with you because you've invested not only raising but multiplying your leadership base, ministry becomes fun. So here then is Jethro's advice in verse 21 of Exodus 18. "Moreover," he said, "look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chief of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens." I simply refer to this as raising leaders at all levels. That's what I meant earlier when I said I love this particular passage, because it does not only deal with leaders, small group leaders, but it deals with all levels of leadership. Leaders of thousands in our context would be our senior pastors. Leaders of hundreds would be our lead pastors. Leaders of 50s would be our coach, our leadership coaches overseeing small group leaders. And of course, our leaders of tens, that would be our small group leaders. At least that would be in our context. Verse 25, "Moses chose able men out of all Israel." Now, let me pause there for a moment. Please realize that our main churches, our churches in the capital cities, whether that's Cape Town or Johannesburg, Pretoria, do not have the monopoly of leaders. For all we know, some of the finest evangelists, pastors, teachers, church planters, young apostles will be coming out of far-flung churches, or in our cases, we call them provincial churches. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And here's the expected result, verse 23. "If you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace." That's where of course, the Hebrew word for shalom. But I love how NIV 84 version puts it. "If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain And all these people will go home satisfied. So the translation of shalom or peace is that people are just coming home with so much contentment and gladness. So here's what typical church looks like. I'll show you the diagram. The first diagram you'll see is the top-down model, which is really the world's model of leadership. You can see there the boss is on the top, the members are down below. Now, in the second picture, other churches do the exact opposite. We call this the Moses syndrome. One-man show. He becomes the carpet, or the leadership team becomes the carpet for everyone to step on. They get overwhelmed and eventually burns out. So the third is what we consider an ideal leadership setup. Leaders still model servant leadership, but they still carry the weight. The members are up there, the leaders are down here, which is biblical picture of leadership. Leaders are servant, but as the church continues to grow and expand, there is a healthy base of multiplying leaders that carry the weight of the ministry. So the numbers is really irrelevant. Your number could be 500, it could be 5,000, it could be 50,000, and there no one gets overwhelmed because you expand the base of your leadership and everyone is carrying the weight. So the result of that is that the people are glad and no one falls to the cracks, simply because everyone, even though the church could be in the thousands, everyone is a part of something, a smaller community where they are taken care of. If we don't have that, I mean, you would not even notice maybe until a year later that so-and-so is gone, simply because there's just too many people in church. So here are a few lessons learned from this narrative. One, empowering leadership can multiply your effectiveness while giving young and next generation leaders a chance to grow. So the more we empower and multiply leadership base, the more we multiply our effectiveness and give our leaders a chance to also mature and use their gifts. So it wasn't a matter of taking leadership from Moses. It was a matter of reordering and dispensing leadership in such a way that other people can share the load with him. So just like Moses, many leaders can fall into the trap that victimizes many dynamic leaders. So watch out, because like me, I'm very passionate. So it's just a go, go, go all the time. Moses allowed himself to be responsible for the problems of all the people. Like Moses, we too can get distracted by works other leaders can do. The misconception is that sometimes leaders feel they are the only ones who can do the necessary task, when in fact there are many others just as capable of handling part of the load. I love how Jethro put it in Exodus 18 verse 22, when he said, "Every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they shall decide themselves. So it'll be easier for you and they will bear the burden with you." So the more we empower people, let them take care of all the other responsibilities, we focus on what really matters. So as pastors and leaders, we need to be mindful with our time. So I guess at the next slide, there's just some practical tips. Mindful of our time in raising and multiplying leaders. Otherwise, we simply allow the most urgent things to dominate us. There will always be another meeting, another crisis. There's always someone who will need the pastor's attention. As leaders realize that those supposedly urgent things may not always be the best investment of our time. Discern what truly needs your attention. You may wake up months and years later and realize you have made very little headway on your goals for fulfilling your vision. Now, maybe this is just me. I just turned 60 last October last year, and all of a sudden I'm beginning to count my days, just like Proverbs says, count your so that you may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days aright. If I get to live 80 years, that's giving me 20 more years of prime years. Man, that's only 7,000 days to go. So I'm a lot more conscientious with the way I use my time and not waste it. And so that's the issue. Sometimes we just cruise on autopilot and then we just wake up one day realizing, my goodness, we are even nowhere near what we want this church or this ministry to be. So as leaders, and borrowing from an airplane analogy, we need to spend more time at 30,000 feet where we can see the big picture and have a view of what truly matters. We need to be judicious in saying no to things. And that might keep some people unhappy in the short term, but ultimately, it will keep your ministry from having a more significant impact. Some missionaries may do everything right, language, immersion, contextualization, but if you know what, if you do not empower and multiply leaders, you might end up writing a book about your great experience, but you will end up doing all the work many years later. Pastor Steve, even though he did not do the typical language thing, but because he focused on empowering and multiplying leaders, the work in the Philippines has not only grown tremendously, it has also flourished. So if we are not deliberate about multiplying leaders, you get overwhelmed. So in the next slide, I think this speaks about things that are at stake. You get overwhelmed, you end up doing much of the work of the ministry, especially as you begin to gain some traction in growth. You get burned out, then there will be other things that will be at stake. Your health will be at risk. There will be misplaced family priority. Your spiritual life can suffer. You can get susceptible to temptation, even pride. There are men and women greater, more anointed than us that have fallen because of this. They have neglected, they've gotten too busy with ministry. And sometimes also, of course, implications, growth can be stunted. Now, when it comes to multiplying leaders, bear in mind that good and effective leaders don't just happen. And depending on the size of your church, it is a result of deliberate, intentional, even systematic way of developing and multiplying leaders. We need to focus our efforts to multiply leaders because multiplication is what the church needs today. If we are going to overcome the member to leader ratio, we need to intentionally develop next generation of pastors and leaders. And believe it or not, many of these future leaders are just there in your congregation, waiting to be identified and equipped for the ministry. So today, literally, just make a list of those in your church and start developing them for leadership. So here's where I Lead comes in. Thanks to the effort spearheaded by Pastor Steve Merle in developing the 4 I's of leadership multiplication process. That's identify, instruct, impart, and intern. So let's take a closer look at each of these multiplication factors. First is identify. Now this requires intentionality. It's not going to happen if you are not going to be intentional about this. Intentionally identifying and developing leaders is not a popular approach or priority in many ministry circles. What distinguishes a good movement from bad ones is their commitment to identify and invest in its people and to train and provide platforms for ministry that will make them effective and fruitful, especially among high capacity catalytic leaders in the future. So remember, leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Watch out for fruitfulness, leadership stature. Sometimes God will give you a special discernment as a leader to see, the future Davids, the future Pauls, the future Peters. Look for eagerness to grow in character. Pastor Steve suggested this guide by looking for faith people, faithful, available, involved, teachable, hungry. Sometimes we don't wait for them to come. We don't wait for them to approach us or respond to an altar call. Sometimes when we feel like there is leadership in a capacity in a certain person, we go to them and call out God's calling on their lives. Now, back to Jethro model, we have to identify not only leaders, small group leaders of tens, but leaders of thousands, hundreds, and fifties. While other ministries might even struggle to raise and empower their leaders of tens. Why? Because the stereotype is, only the full-time ministers do the work of the ministry. We, on the other hand, must be deliberate and intentional in raising leaders of tens, of fifties, and of hundreds. But the question is, have we raised enough leaders who have the capacity to lead thousands and hundreds? Maybe in our main churches we have, but we need more. There's an even greater need in outlying places who can be regional leaders of hundreds and of thousands. We need to identify apostolic and catalytic leaders and know how to process the call of God in these young leaders' lives. Our apostolic and global leaders met in Dubai recently, and one of the global emphasis for 2022 is expansion. And crucial to that expansion, of course, are our ENC, Every Nation Campus conferences, where we have to call out the callings of people in their lives. But another one major thing in that is to identify pioneering leaders or catalytic leaders. So I'm glad that this is perfectly in line with our emphasis for 2022. Pastors, we cannot stop short of just good leaders. We should be intentional about identifying, equipping, empowering, and sending these future apostolic leaders among us. Catalytic leaders adopt new ways of thinking and challenge old ways of doing things, opening new doors for greater ministry opportunities. They are selfless, they're assertive, they are forward thinking. So I hope that in as much as we're passionate to raise leaders of tens, we also need to be passionate to raise leaders of 50s, of hundreds, of hundreds and thousands. Second is instruct. Not all instruction is the same. We make sure we help them grow in their learning needs, both in cognitive areas as well as practical ministry skills. That's a problem sometimes if we just send people to the schools, they learn a lot of information, but sometimes they just don't have the practical know-how. So we need to have both of those. Each nation or region need to develop their own leadership development program that takes people systematically, if I may say so, to various levels of training to constantly upgrade their skills to meet the needs of our growing and expanding churches and ministries. For the Philippines, that would be the 4E. So in the next slide, there you go, our 4 integrated. So everything starts with discipleship, okay? So leadership starts with discipleship. Then we have the Leadership 113, our in-house victory leaders training. That's an added motivation for people who will be accepted for this course. They better be a small group leader. In fact, we've also raised the bar for our 10 days team. You cannot be a part, not even lead, but just to be a part of our 10 days team or a missions short term, if you are not a small group leader. Can you imagine raising the bar higher? Whereas before, if you have money, you just want to go, you go. No, we are only sending fruitful, proven people. I mean, we've really raised the bar in terms of even doing our mission short-term work. So that's Leadership 113. Now, should they decide to go full-time ministry, there's a line in the middle to cross over full-time work. And for that, we have our 4 schools of ministry of the School of Church Leadership, School of Church Planning, School of Campus Ministry, School of World Mission. Incorporated in our schools of ministry is Leadership 215, which is the global minimum theological standards for pastors and leaders. That is a requirement for us for ordination here in Asia. And now I'm very excited that we have launched a new global initiative, which is the Every Nation Seminary. So for more information, just visit our website, www.everynationseminary.org. Now, according to 1 Corinthians 3:10, catalytic leaders are builders, equippers, and mobilizers. I think it says there, it says, according to the grace God has given me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it, but let each one take care how he builds upon it. So we could see that first and foremost, catalytic leaders are builders. These are the kinds of leaders we want to raise. They are the kinds that builds carefully in the lives of people. They have the capability to equip others, also how to make disciples, and they mobilize people to ministry. The last thing you really wanted is for these leaders to be consumers of knowledge, but not reproduce leaders. That's the dilemma of our current church today. It has become a consumer thing. People are just getting more and more and more, but there is no output. You don't see it translated in them being fruitful by discipling other people. No, we wanted them to become producers, builders, equippers, and mobilizers. Number 3 is impart. Impart. Invest in the lives of your leaders. Make time. Create time. Be intentional with your schedule. Decide what impartation you want them to get. Great leaders don't just happen. They are a result of someone's investment and impartation. Someone has spent time with them. Someone has imparted wisdom, sharing valuable lessons, life lessons, and insight. So know who also they need to get impartation from. And, we do not have the monopoly for impartation. There are other leaders you want them to spend time with also, so that they could rub those gifts in their lives. A good leader has watched someone model godly leadership and good behavior. Many leaders who grow in church and ministry are those that spend a lot of time with other more mature and seasoned leaders as they minister alongside each other and learn and share things together. Many of these leadership growth moments actually takes place during these times of impartation. So finally, intern. Provide on-the-job training. So we've discussed with our pastors now, I am challenging them, most of these people are so used to Metro Manila where everything is just available. Why don't we send some of our upcoming catalytic leaders and place them in new church plant, let them stay there for a month to serve, to grow. I mean, we need to create these opportunities, give them exposure, give them platform to exercise and develop their gifts. Coach them, make adjustment, always encourage. I was just talking to one of our mission pastors. His name is Carlo Retilla. You might know some of them. Some of you might know them. He told me that they have just identified 250 young people with a heart for world missions. This is just one ministry unit in the Philippines. 250. So they are starting to give them ministry exposure to different ministries in the church, training them to understand and participate in various ministry undertakings. By the time they get to the school of ministry, they have enough ministry experience to get them going to the next level of their training prior to actually going into their field ministry assignment. Again, our hope is that their internship will give them firsthand experience how to model multiplication, how leaders are raised, and hope that they would know how to reproduce themselves to others when they become leaders themselves. This is really the heart of 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. Many of you are familiar with this passage. It says, and what you, speaking of Timothy, second generation leader, have heard me, the Apostle Paul, first generation leader, in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men, third generation leader, and who will also be able to teach others, fourth generation leaders. This is an amazing picture of leaders reproducing other leaders. As we close, let me point out 2 of the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership by John Maxwell because of its relevance on our subject. So I'll just close with this quick thought. One is the law of empowerment. This law states only secure leaders give authority to others. This means that secure leaders spend their time identifying leaders, building them up, giving them resources, giving them authority and responsibility, and then turning them loose to achieve their ministry calling. Now, of course, one time I was talking to one of the leaders. I've noticed that we have invested so much in this young leader, and when he came back for training, to serve, I noticed that he just kind of fades out. So I asked the pastor. I said, "What happened to this so-and-so leader?" He said, "Well, we have to put them aside for a while because he's just full of himself. He had too much pride." And I thought, who has none? I mean, everybody has. So this is not a time to put, you rebuke them, you correct them, you teach them Jesus' model of leadership, but you don't put them aside. Are you threatened by them? There are no perfect leaders. So along the way, we fix them. We adjust, we coach, we make the necessary corrections unless they've done really something that disqualifies them from ministry. So I just thought we should also just keep that in mind. So again, keep in mind also insecure leadership. On the other hand, spend their time suspicious of those around them and do everything they can to undermine people's potential and growth. We've seen that in the life of Saul and David. We don't want to be Sauls. We want to empower the Davids of our generation. Our passion is that the leaders we raise will far surpass everything we've ever done, that they will be 10 times better or more than what we've ever accomplished. So that is what an empowering culture should look like. Second, is the law of lead. The truth is, not all leaders have the same leadership capacity. Although leaders can grow, people's leadership capacity can be limited by their faith, people's skills, planning abilities, vision, dedication to success, and even past results. I always tell our leaders, this is not a first come, first served basis. When we find potential high capacity leaders, we need to be secure enough to build them up and launch them to do greater works and fulfill their ministry, their calling in the ministry. Because this is what happens when a David, who everyone is praising that they've killed, they're slain their 10,000s, and you only 1,000, there will be some insecurities. You know, we must come to understand that as we develop the leaders around us, we not only inadvertently raise our own value as a leader, but our organizations are benefited in the process as well. Now, remember this. This is why I always tell people, don't just raise leaders, raise sons and daughters in the faith, because not a single one of us is intimidated by the success of our own kids, right? In fact, we sometimes go borderline exaggeration as to what they've done or accomplished because we are so proud of them. That should be our ethos. And for young people, you don't ever see a kid growing up insulting his dad, looking down on him because he has better education, better wisdom, better this and that. No, we don't. We always honor. It's a code of honor that if this is your spiritual dad, you always honor them for life. You always thank them for how you've raised them up. So it works both ways. So no matter where you are today in your ministry, it's never too soon or too late to start investing in your church's upcoming leaders. It's time to be intentional about it. If you commit to make leadership multiplication a top priority, you will look back in a few years and praise God for the decision you've made and what God has done through your ministry.